Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. Today we have some very special guests who are involved with the Break the Bonds campaign in Louisiana and with Jewish Voice for Peace. We have Rose, who uses they and them pronouns, who's going to share a little bit more about this campaign. So welcome, Rose. And to get us started, could you share a little bit more about the Break the Bonds campaign, why it's important, and also just any context around how you got involved in it?
Yeah, happy to talk about that, Jordan. My name is Rose, and I organize with Break the Bonds Louisiana. This campaign was born out of the New Orleans chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, and it started in March of 2024 after the October 7th attacks by Israel in Gaza. And the national media was getting a lot of attention to issues around Israel at the time, and particularly about how the U.S. is invested in the state of Israel, not only through direct government aid and weapons supplies, but also through individual and corporate financial backing of the state of Israel. And an article was published about the states that hold Israel bonds, and Louisiana was on that list. Our Treasury holds, at the time, held $40 million in Israel bonds. They purchased 10 million after the October 7th attacks to show their support of Israel. And our campaign was born to demand that the Treasury not reinvest these Israel bonds when they come up for maturation. And yeah, so that's the campaign, just building up a public pressure campaign through Louisiana to demand that the Treasury not reinvest the state's money in Israel.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I really appreciate the connections that you're weaving between how our financial systems domestically are connected to militarism and occupation abroad, and also the militarism that's happening domestically with ICE funding terror in prisons. And so, can you just share a little bit more about the interconnectedness between the genocide happening in Gaza, the occupation that's happening there, and how that is paralleled here as well?
So a lot of the technologies that have been tested in Israel over the past 60, 70 years have received funding from both the US and Israeli military. And that surveillance prototype and like checkpoints and facial recognition has been used against Palestinians to control and occupy um, their land and territories. And now we're seeing that in the US and with ICE and regular police departments in general as well, they've started using a lot more surveillance technology and training with the Israeli military to oppressed communities here in the United States, which is not new. The proximity to it for a lot of people have just gotten closer ever since Trump took office, and funding for ICE has increased. So lots of parallels in technology and also just the tactics for use of force.
I would love to hear both the how this campaign got started, But maybe before we even dig into that, just to like peel this like onion back a little bit more, because I know you mentioned your demands are to not renew the bonds. Can you share a little bit about why um, stopping the renewal of the bonds is so crucial in the limitations that exist when it comes to Israeli bonds? Like you can't just pull the money out today.
So Israel bonds, when you purchase them, have no secondary market. So you can buy a bond to last either for 2 years to 15 years, and you have to wait for that maturity date from whatever time you pick when you buy it. It can be 5 years. Um, Basically, you have to wait for that money to mature before you can get it back and any returns made on that investment. So part of the campaign is to encourage the Treasury never to buy new bonds, but also not to reinvest the ones they currently hold. Israel bonds as an investment are not lucrative because of Israel's unstable economy and just geopolitical tensions. Israel bonds don't make a lot of high returns. And we had someone run the data for us when we first were investigating the Israel bonds that the state holds and how many of them we hold in relation to other investments in certain funds. And we found that these bonds make practically no returns for the state of Louisiana. And particularly, that's important because the Israel bonds that Louisiana does invest come from our state's education funds and are supposed to be invested into markets that will make returns to keep our schools funded. Um, and that's not happening, partly because the treasurer has chosen to invest in Israel bonds and reject his fiduciary responsibility over wanting to show support and friendship towards the state of Israel.
Yeah, I know there was a county in Florida that's one of like the biggest holders of Israeli bonds. And that the credit quality is being downgraded because of what Israel is doing. Like, we know that war is not sustainable. We know that genocide is not sustainable or a good investment. So, thank you for explaining a little bit about how it works as well and the connections to like supporting public education. I would love to hear more about how the Break the Bonds campaign got started. I know it's part of the Jewish Voice for Peace, but can you share a little bit more of the lore of how it came to be and what successes have you seen so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So JVP, so Jewish Voice for Peace is nationally operating Jewish organization, and the organization recognizes that Israel does commit tons of human rights violations in the name of Jewish people. And it's not only the United States as a country that keeps Israel funded, it's also individuals and institutions like we've talked about. And so JVP has called their local chapters all throughout the US to identify individuals or institutions that hold Israel bonds because Israel bonds are unrestricted investments in the state of Israel that can be money that can be put towards anything that they deem necessary. So that can be government spending and military spending. And Israel bonds have been very normalized in Zionist Jewish life. So oftentimes, as like a wedding gift or a bat mitzvah gift, someone will be gifted like $100 worth of Israel bonds, and you're expected to cherish that and recognize that that money in your name is upholding the state of Israel and keeping it funded, and it can be a very treasured gift to receive. And so JVP is asking Jewish individuals and at a larger institutional level to take responsibility for people's own direct funding of Israel and the genocide against Palestinians and recognize their role, take accountability for it, and divest when the opportunity presents itself when those bonds mature. So that's why Jewish Voice for Peace National has made this call to their local chapters, and we in New Orleans and Louisiana have been able to respond because our state holds Israel bonds. And the whole campaign started with three dedicated organizers who were then curious about where the state was getting the money to invest in Israel bonds, which we found out were coming from the state's education funds. And after finding that out, of course, just kind of lit the fire in us to encourage and demand this quote unquote divestment, but essentially just not reinvestment of Israel bonds. I don't know exactly how we found out which trusts the bonds were held in, but once we figured that out, we started submitting a lot of public records requests to the Treasury because they are a state and technically public institution. They are required to respond to public records requests. And that's one of the reasons why we chose the Treasury and these bonds as a target for this campaign, because it can be a lot harder when you're launching divestment campaign to find information about the holdings of private businesses and nonprofits and universities because they're not required to disclose what they're investing in, whereas cities, states, to an extent, are required to provide that information. So keeping an up-to-date eye on when the bonds were purchased, when they're going to mature, and building our campaign based on the maturity date. So our, like I had stated earlier, the campaign started in March of 2024, and the first maturity date for a set of $5 million worth of Israel bonds was set for February 1st, 2025. And these organizers, with the help and support of the rest of the chapter, launched a public pressure campaign. And it was somewhat difficult being in a more conservative state, in a pretty liberal city, which is New Orleans, because New Orleans had most of our organizing power, but it really is an entire state issue. So pushing to make it a statewide campaign and building out our connections across the state has taken time. It's still happening. We were able to rally enough people and attempt to talk to the treasurer because he didn't want to have an actual meeting with us, but we made our messages heard, and some of us were able to go to the state capitol to demand that these bonds were not reinvested. And lo and behold, when we called the Treasury the Monday after February 1st, 2025, the bonds had not been reinvested in Israel. So $5 million less of our state's education funds were going to a genocidal state that repeatedly commits human rights violations. So that was a win. And for a while, we discussed whether or not to make that a public announcement, because we were worried about backlash, and other organizations lobbying the treasurer to reinvest those $5 million or to invest even more. But it's been a slow burn of a win, to be able to publicize and share it. And there's an upcoming maturation date on May 1st of 2026. And so we're replicating some of the strategies that we used last year, and building out new strategies for hopefully the same outcome in May.
Wow. I just want to celebrate. That is such a huge win. Like, congratulations, and especially applying pressure at that level. That's a huge victory. So, congratulations. You did mention, the complexities that come about when it comes to organizing in a conservative state and a red state. Any lessons there that you want to share, or just anything context-wise that you think would be helpful for people living in other red states that also hold Israeli bonds to know or consider for their own campaigns?
One thing that is really useful that I don't think our chapter has utilized to its full extent yet, but we are in the process of, is power mapping and figuring out what connections and who works closely with the decision maker. So whether that's your state treasurer or your city council, people choosing to invest like pension funds and Israel bonds, knowing like who your decision maker is really important, but also knowing who has their ear is a really helpful strategy. And also to build the campaign as broadly as possible, so that you're not just organizing within one city, but making it like statewide or a national wide issue that people care about and can sign on to pretty easily with the petition or get involved at a deeper level through organizing within the campaign.
Thank you. That is helpful context. I would love to share a little bit more of like the practical level of how could folks discover for themselves if there's an institution they know of that's invested in Israeli bonds, because I think that's something you've lifted up a couple times is that sure, like individuals might hold these bonds, but more often than not, it's big institutions with millions and millions of dollars, even billions of dollars that could be invested in these bonds. So can you share a little bit about how would I go and look up to see if something, an organization, an institution that I'm familiar with, is invested in these bonds? Is that like public information?
Um, so you can call and find out if you have personal Israel bonds, have an Israel bond that someone has bought for you in the past, and maybe it's just been sitting and being reinvested without your knowledge. There is actually like an Israel Bonds client support number that you can call, and I won't take the time to share that number now, but it will be linked in some of the resources when this podcast episode is released. So you can call and find out if you have personal Israel bonds, but you will need your social security number for that. Or if you're concerned that your city or your state is investing in Israel bonds, you can file a public records request. Typically, a FOIA request is more of a federal level investigation step, but you could, if the language for a public records request in your state isn't clear, you can cite like FOIA statutes, and you should have access to that same kind of information. The New Orleans Break the Bonds campaign, when we were figuring out our targets, were interested in knowing if the city of New Orleans held any bonds, and we looked through public records requests, got access and information regarding pension funds and retirement funds, and found that New Orleans did not have any investments. But it can be difficult to identify businesses, corporations, and nonprofits and universities that hold Israel bonds because their information isn't subject to the same kind of public access that city and state governments are, or city and state institutions are. So you have to have someone in the university or in the business that really values transparency and ethical investing to figure out that kind of information. So it can be harder. There are tools. It's going to take a little more grit to for institutions like that, private institutions, to disclose what they're investing in, especially if it's something as unethical as Israel bonds and other unethical investments.
Well, that was super helpful. And for folks who are like, ooh, maybe I want to see if I have connections to an Israeli bond or there's an institution you have in mind, like that's a great next step. And Rose, you also mentioned that there's another renewal coming up in May. And so I'm wondering, is there anything that listeners on this show can do to support the organizing work that you all are doing in Louisiana?
Yes, there absolutely is a way for folks to get involved, even if you don't live in Louisiana. So on May 1st, 2026, $10 million in Israel bonds will mature in our state treasury. Again, money that comes from education funds and should be going towards our state schools, will be maturing and has the opportunity to leave the coffers of Israel and go back into the economy of Louisiana. And how people, listeners, anyone can get involved is through signing our petition, because the more signatures we get, the more people who the treasurer care about where these bonds are going, can help us win our goal. And so our petition is on change.org. So it'll be linked in the podcast notes, but also if you just want to give it a quick search, the title is End Louisiana Investments in Israel Bonds, Protect Our Education Funds. So that's one very easy, concrete way to get involved, even if you are not in Louisiana. And the chapter will also be coordinating with the New Orleans JVP Instagram because we don't have, Break the Bonds doesn't have their own social media. So as we get closer to the maturation date, we'll be putting out calls through our social media asking people who support this cause to participate in phone banks. So calling the Treasury, letting them know that these funds should not be going towards Israel. They should be going towards our schools. They should be ethically invested. So there'll be phone bank opportunities and email Zap opportunities. But the first and easiest step is just to put your name on that petition. And if you are local, live in Louisiana, live in New Orleans, you could always reach out through Jewish Voice for Peace NOLA Instagram. And that is a direct way to get put in touch with the campaign if you have interest or organizing skills that you want to put to use.
That is really exciting. And yes, like Rose shared, that will be linked in the show notes. You can get involved and support whether you're local to Louisiana or in another part of the country or the world. And that brings me to my last question. If you could wave a magic wand, what's something that you wish listeners of this show already knew about?
Yeah, Jordan. So Break the Bonds campaigns, even though they aren't considered exactly what a divestment campaign is, because you have to wait for bonds to mature and just say, don't reinvest is not the same as active divestment, being able to take money out of an institution or a bond at any time. But even this anti-reinvestment campaign falls under the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, also known as BDS. So, organizing for a liberated future for Palestine, for people who are living in the U.S., citizens or not. There are lots of ways to get involved in communal liberation. Divestment is just one way. Also, sanctions and boycotting corporate businesses who are still choosing to do business with companies in countries that have made it clear that they are willing to violate human rights for profit. And so getting involved at an economic level through boycott, divestment, and sanctions against companies or countries is a very concrete and tangible way to promote change, because money may go around. That one of the topics of this podcast is reimagining wealth can look, and the way it's distributed, and it doesn't need to be concentrated where it is. So just encouraging people to get involved at a local level, at a national level. Yeah, because economic change has a lot of potential. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for weaving that in, Rose. It's like the only way we're going to actually get to a new or different economy, one that actually supports all of our well-being, is by starting to practice that, whether that's through organizing, whether that's through pressuring to change investments. But as we start to take our own prefigurative steps towards a new economy, that's a good foundation that then we can build from. So really appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth. And thank you so much for tuning in.